try to figure out how to do that. We've got some ideas, but we need to find out from you guys, first off, what exactly does that mean? What does a rural character in a high-density residential neighborhood look like? And then we can talk about future meetings. I do not anticipate getting this done. I'd like to get it done by some point in April so that we could go to the June town meeting. But if we don't, I don't think we should be asking the selectmen to hold a special town meeting. This is something that we can continue to work on, and if we get the R1 done, we can work on the R2 or the R3 and work on the other districts. But I don't think it's necessary to go and have a special town meeting. I don't know how all of you feel about that. I'm open to suggestions.
Why don't we wait and see where we are before we jump that particular question?
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, because we may not get there in June.
Been known to happen. I'll speak, if it's okay with everybody else, a little bit to the comprehensive plan and why it says what it says now, okay? When the comprehensive plan review committee met 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, we recognized that in R1, and I'll limit my discussion to that, but it's not just in R1, there were property owners who had larger parcels in what is fundamentally a high-density 1-acre zone. And the conflict there is, if you have a 1-acre parcel, that's, you have a house lot, those are easy. But if you had, 20 acres or 50 acres, the limitation on certain things that you could do because you were, quite frankly, arbitrarily placed in an R1 district, seemed to us to be too restrictive. So we approached it from the standpoint of the larger landowners within that R1 district. What could we do as a town to free up the possibilities that they would have for things like agritourism and animal husbandry and some of the other things that are mentioned on the list? We also recognized that there's a balance to strike between the 1-acre or smaller lot owners living in a high-density residential area versus some of the uses that could be potentially put in place in the larger lots. So I think the purpose of this discussion is how do we appropriately strike that balance? On the one hand, you don't want to have somebody who's in a high-density neighborhood suddenly overcome by something they didn't plan on next door to them, and balance that against the right of the people that have the larger lots to do some of the things that they might like to do that are currently restricted or, conditional. So that's the basis for what we came up with in terms of the comprehensive plan, and it was approved by the town. In the course of doing that, the question became, how many people does this involve? How many landowners? And I'm working with data that we put together in 2014, so this is somewhat dated. I'm sure it's not correct, but it'll give you an approximation of an idea of how things went. We took the town map and we looked at sizes of parcels, and we broke it down into various groups. We picked 10 acres as a bottom line. Okay, in the last permutation of the animal husbandry suggestion, it was 5 acres, and I personally would be fine with 5 acres, but we chose 10 as a starting point. In R1, there are 5 people, or 5 lots that are between 10 and 19 acres, and 3 lots between 20 and 29 acres, 2 lots between 30 and 49 acres, and 1 lot of greater than 50 acres. And again, this is dated information. But that left us with 11 lots that were solely in R1 of better than 10 acres or more, I should say. In addition to that, we also looked at and tried to address with individual landowners split lots. And if we include split lots, there are another 21 split lots that are split either between R1 and R2, R1 and BI, R1 and R4, or R1 and the Alfred Road District. So that brings us to a total of 32 lots in R1 that are 10 acres or more. And that's a significant number of people who might have options that they don't currently have if there were some changes that are made. So that was our starting point and the rationale for what we had recommended that is currently in the comprehensive plan. Marty has a question.
Yeah, Mike.
When we were grouping that together, or when you grouped that together, I do not think you had the new districts involved, like the DB1 and the DB2. Okay? And speaking of that,
Yeah.
will that change any of your ideas or numbers along the way? Just as a,
Yeah, no,
it's a new
I understand.
wrench.
I understand what you're saying, and off the top of my head, I'm gonna say not significantly. It might affect one property owner or another, but the overall pattern and picture won't change. And as I said, and since I've been on this committee way too long, not 2014. Since 2014, I'm sure there have been parcels that have changed hands, that have changed size. So as I said, that's not current information, but it's a ballpark. It gives you a picture of what we looked at, why we looked at it the way we did, and why we came to some of the recommendations that we made.
'Cause I'm looking at the map, the same one that Cindy's looking at, it's like the third or fourth page of the comp plan. You have it listed out, for growth in rural areas, and the growth areas, cover R1 and down into R2.
And also R3.
Is it R3?
Yeah.
Okay. And you have that cute little strip right here. Why was
That's
that?
R4. Well, I'm glad you asked. This particular map and those boundaries, I used the word arbitrary before. And I think that's a really good word to describe how this was done back in the early 90s. I would be hard pressed to say that I agree now with the philosophy that was in place then. And I would also suggest that we take a look at the fact that this mad plan of having everybody move to here and nobody build houses here has not worked. So, to throw an even larger wrench in this discussion, maybe we need to think really creatively as opposed to just a little creatively.
You'll find out.
Yes.
Yeah, because again, when I look at the map and I'm going, okay, why is this, that little section cut off? It's completely surrounded by road areas. It makes no sense. I had the same concept when I thought of the R1 district. Look at some of the neighborhoods, or some of the areas that it runs through. Good morning.
Sorry,
Good
I
morning.
apologize. I couldn't get my garage door open.
When you look at it, it shows up better on the map up here.
Yeah.
When you look at the R1.
Could you
And-
What
maybe,
your point is, what you're talking
For us
about?
without maps. yeah,
A lot of stuff up there.
this right here. So that's,
Right, there's that section there, but if you look at just the R1, which is the light yellow color,
yeah,
when I look at that, I think to myself, that is very strange, because it's not connected together, and some of,
But again, I think that was in the
it
90s
was,
or
this
whatever.
is
Because
coming back.
when you look at the area along the river, that was floodplain area along the Kennebunk River, so you look at that yellow area and it only goes like so many feet, and that definitely splits a lot of large lots right there
Mhm.
between R1 and the floodplain area. And that section that you're talking about is because the railroad track goes right there, and you can't cross the railroad track properties.
Okay.
And then Kennebunk Land Trust, I believe, is on the other side, so there's gonna be, so I think that's why it was left out. Because way back then, it was, you know, who's gonna build, and you can't get access to that land and from either side. So it's kind of landlocked, so those were some of the reasons why, but again, I think it was like in the early 90s, or when did we first, 70s, when, I don't remember, I'm trying to think. But basically, they said, you have to have these growth areas, and everybody thought, well, we'll line them up against the major roads. And again, I agree with John, that maybe that needs to be relooked at,
I think it
because
could be
a
looked at.
lot of the subdivisions have gone into the R4s and not necessarily into those areas, you know?
But That's all part of the confusion
Mhm.
that I've had, and I'm sure the other planning board
Yeah.
members have had it. Because I look at that and I go, well, the R1 is split by the R2.
Yeah,
Really, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out why. I like the explanation on that R4 strip and why it's there.
That's why.
I didn't know why it was
Yeah.
there.
And part of the reason, you know, you had said that, well, subdivisions are out of the R1, well, there's, you know, the R1 is starting, for the most part, it's saturated. You know, So you're starting to lose spots for subdivisions, single-family homes, fine, but you're starting to lose land for subdivisions in the R1.
But again, you have a lot of large landowners even in the R1 area, and I think what's happening is if you look at even the subdivisions, they're all popping up off the roads and not getting further back into the large lots as like, I don't know if that's part of it or, you know. But you do have all of these large landowners here along Limerick Road that are being split. And even more the town property that we bought is split between R1 and, you know, shoreline.
and that's another reason for considering changing some of these, conditional uses, is because there are either split lots or there are 1 acre lots right next to R4. So if the rationale is that somebody having a certain activity on their large lot is going to impact a residential neighborhood, so therefore you can't do it within the R1, as an example, how is that different than doing it right next to R1, because you've got this line that just arbitrarily divides 1 acre lots from 3 and more? That's a problem I think we need to wrestle with.
I think I can address some of that. I think part of the reason why we have that disparity with that sudden boundary change between the R1 and the R4, especially on the west side of Limerick Road, is because of the huge amount of floodplain soils and wetlands that are on that side of the road that are associated with the Kennebunk River. And the problem is that a lot of it is frankly undevelopable. I guess I should have caused a shoreline zoning map that would have helped out a little bit more. But it's rough stuff, it's not developable, you really can't. And I think the folks who have recently done the actors here, and they're very much aware of that condition. That condition continues all along the river, so I think that's one of the reasons why the 2005 folk did that, because it just wasn't developable. That was one of the reasons. why
Yeah.
they did it.
But it doesn't change the fact that you still have this severe cutoff. You've got 1 acre lots and high-density residential right next to what is supposed to be rural conservation. So therefore, in terms of land use, the R4 land could still be used quite easily for animal husbandry or agritourism or any of those uses, despite the soils, even though it's not developable.
Those that are in the resource protection district cannot have animal husbandry. by
Well,
state
but,
standard.
you know, if we wanna go down lot by lot, you know how much time that takes. I think probably we need to approach it from the standpoint of, you know, a general rule that applies, or at least what are the general problems that we're looking at.
So are you suggesting maybe a transition buffer all the way between zones of where's
Not necessarily, I think what I'm suggesting is that as we look at uses, look at what is going to solve the problem for both types of properties. And I've given this a lot of thought, and I've basically come down to one, and that is setbacks. So if you're a 1 acre lot butted up against a larger lot, regardless of what zone you're in, if someone has that larger lot and they want to do activity X, doesn't matter what it is, if they have sufficient land to give sufficient setback, it shouldn't impact the 1 acre lot owner. If they don't have sufficient land for the setback, then they can't indulge in that activity. That would keep it very simple.
Has come to that a similar conclusion with the animal husbandry. We want to allow those large lots to be able to have it, but we needed to have some type of setback, just because it might impact someone who was already there.
Right.
Next door to them, yeah.
And I hate to say it, but I think that's the important part. If you're already there, we should not be allowing a use that is going to negatively impact your land, you were there first. Now, if you wanna buy a lot, I'm gonna pick on Mark,
Do
okay?
it again, you always
If
do.
you, you're here, and it makes it easy. If you wanna build a house next to where Mark has his property, I don't wanna hear a complaint about the fact that the guy's got cows. He had cows when you built your house,
Right,
and that's my
Essentially.
position. That really is what I think.
That makes sense.
Uh,
but at the same time, right now, I think we're telling people who have a large lot in R one, you can't do this, and you can't have these animals, or you can't do horses or cows, or this many, more than this many.
That's the
And
problem.
I think that's the problem, is like, you know, on Limerick Road, I mean, look at the alpacas, I don't wanna, you know, but she does a very nice operation, but she has more, I'm not sure how many acres she has, but she's in an R one district. And yet at the same time, you know, if you, to start doing those now is, you know, I mean, she's limited as far as what, you know, as far as, you know, like some of the regulations that we have in R one limit, or somebody coming into like Bert Cowgill's property, if they wanna start making a working farm out of that again, you know, it's in the R one district. So I think we need to realize that if he can buffer it correctly, they, you know, just, if they have 100 acres, they should be able to do more, even if they're in the R one zone, without being, you know, held to the R one standards by meeting certain, you know, setting whatever things the planning board wants to set for guidelines, and say, you know, okay, you've got setbacks, you've got these things that you can do, but not, cause they were not farming, but if they've got like 50 acres or 100 acres, they might not have been farming, but if they wanna start farming now, they should not be limited because they're in R one, as long as they meet standards.
Through chair.
yeah, hang on just a second. I caught chip out of the corner of my eye.
I would point out that the animal husbandry revisions, which were not voted on at the last town meeting, and the small stable, I don't remember the precise term, equestrian stable, both of those addressed the concerns that Mrs. DeKinderen is expressing to a greater or lesser extent.
I agree. You don't have to, go ahead, no.
Go ahead, Marty.
Okay, on your R one, how do we address a farm that was there, and they wanna convert it into another use, not necessarily farming, and they have the acreage, and it's not a permitted use? I'm
That's
the
what
only-
I'm saying, is maybe we need to review some of these R one uses, and if it's appropriate for that size lot, you know, does it have to be, maybe our standards need to be more like Donna said, overall the whole town, rather than just one zone.
Okay, the reason I was speaking of a particular farm is on Old Limerick Road, okay? And they wanted to turn that into a function hall, okay? And it's not permitted. And they have the acreage or anything else.
It's DB2 already.
Limiting the family to split the lots up,
Well, I think that goes back, let's find the simplest common denominator. If it's setbacks and buffering, that's pretty straightforward and simple, and that could apply anywhere. I mean, the other question is, what realistic impact will this have on the neighbors? If it can be solved by setbacks and buffering, then you have your answer. If it can't, then perhaps there's other things that you might need to look at.
You could put your performance standards for that, you know, for that.
Yeah.
It's not different than any other, right?
what I'm going at is that there's already an existing barn and an existing house already there. You aren't gonna move something that's been there for 70 years or better.
But if I'm gonna have functions there, I'm gonna have increased traffic, maybe in the middle of a residential neighborhood.
And that's
So
exactly
that's
what.
where the performance standards need to come in, the
But that's
performance
what-
standards and the buffering.
Right, but that's also where, and this is the harsh reality, that's also the reason why the planning board didn't pursue that anymore, was because the neighborhood, existing residential neighborhood, came out in very strong opposition against it, because they were across the street from it. Two of the residents had already had function halls before, and they knew the impacts of it, they were very much aware of what those impacts would be, so they basically told the town, we're gonna fight you very hard on this, and basically, the owner said, I'm not willing to do this, I'm not willing to go through this and antagonize the neighbor. And that's the flip side of this. You can put a function, put something in there that right now seems to be okay and compatible, but then neighborhoods develop around it, and it is a residential district. Maybe we shouldn't call it a residential district, because people have expectations of residential districts, and the planning board right now has encountered a great deal of problems just even in a rural district. And what the residents consider to be incompatible land uses. And that's some of the things that the planning board is wrestling with, and so we not only have the potential for current conflicts, but the potential for future conflicts.
But
We
there's
have
no
to be
way to
careful.
get around it.
No, there's no way to get around it.
No way to get around
But
it.
but you do have to make sure there's certain uses that won't lead to necessarily.
You can't allow all kinds of uses, that's why you have the different zones, right? I mean, you can't, there's a reason for that, and it's to protect everybody else and to protect for growth and so.
So what,
Go ahead, Tom.
I wanna go back to what Marty was saying, we have to be careful, once we open this bottle, where do we draw the line? So I think we all agree, more agriculture and horses, it's probably a good thing for the town. But how about a function hall, how about, maybe, someone has enough setback, and you have a machine shop or in the R4 district, and someone who owns that land might say, why not? You're not bothering anybody, so, so we have to be really careful, once you start making changes, how do we cap it?
Yes, Susan?
Well, as you all know, I come from a different planet, and I come from the left coast as opposed to the east
But
coast.
you smartened up and moved to.
I did, but I'm originally from here.
We'll find out in a minute.
But some of us have made significant investments in our properties. Perhaps to act as the tip of the spear of what one might consider is coming, given our surroundings in Kennebunkport, southern Maine, New Hampshire, Boston, bedroom communities and whatever. And if you want people to feel comfortable and safe to invest in the land, to build homes and live, I personally don't wanna live next door to a propane dispensary facility, or in some cases, more industrial pursuits. I wanna know that farming and, or maybe other things, and we can come up with whatever designations that are consistent with and compatible with R1 zoning to protect land values. So, not to, my very recent experience is that properties in Kennebunkport are assessed at and are valued at 4 times the value of structures and land development that they are in Arundel. And one of the reasons I've learned through investigation and just sort of being around is that there's a certain respect for neighborhoods and what people can expect from their surroundings. Now, I'm not saying it all has to be developments or single-family homes or anything like that, but if you want to draw residents that want to invest in the community, so to speak, and I'm not saying that they're gonna uplift it or gentrify it or whatever, but seriously invest in the neighborhood, they need to know that what they buy is protected. And, you know, there are certain things that are before the planning board right now. If it was next door to me, I would go bananas. Because I made a significant investment, and that is gonna directly impact my decision-making, and I, you know, might not have known about flexibility in planning board rules to allow that kind of enterprise to take place within earshot of my brand new home.
Mark, did you have something you were gonna say?
No.
Okay.
I'm gonna hold back if you need.
And I totally agree with, you know, most of that, because I think a lot of that you're talking about, like the propane places, that definitely needs to be in the commercial, the DB one, the DB two zones. And that's why that is the business area. You know, anything like that, you don't want, you know, I totally agree, I had a fuel oil business next to me, and my biggest concern is if they have a leak, that's gonna go right downhill into the pond and that. So nobody should have to worry about those types of things.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm not suggesting that properties that are grandfathered shouldn't be allowed to operate. What I'm saying is, where I was in Exeter, New Hampshire for 4 years, those, you know, that flexibility in their zoning ceased when the property was sold. So I think, you know, that's not unreasonable to make it, to change the zoning when the property is sold. So if Marty has a shop next to me and it's there when I buy, I think that it's reasonable to, you know, to agree that he gets to operate that business as long as he's there. And whatever conditions apply to his family and whatever. But once it's sold, then perhaps conditions change.
There may be some issues with that, so.
Maybe, I mean, I don't know.
A lot of
but-
issues with that business, if you can't operate it.
Good discussion so far. Were you going to say something? Okay.
Not yet.
Mark, quick fingers. Okay. Wow. Okay,
Through the chair,
yes, yes, sir.
a question. These conversations all assume that map has to stay the way it is now.
For purposes of this meeting, that map does, because to change that map requires a comprehensive plan to go through and modify what they have. So for our purposes, that map stays the way it is. Because the planning board, unless, if you own a piece of land, just so everybody understands, if you own a piece of land and you wanna have that changed to a different zone, you have to petition the town, you would come to the planning board, you would go to the selectmen, and then you would go to town meeting and persuade them to do so. The planning board does not, thankfully, have the arbitrary ability to change the zoning on any parcel in town. That is something that is up to the town meeting.
So tonight's meeting is trying to change it so everybody's happy within the R1 zone?
No,
Most people.
no,
Nobody said that.
the
Nobody said that? I thought I heard it in the back.
No, no, no.
I thought I heard it in the parking lot.
The purpose of this meeting is to resolve the conflicts between the planning and the comprehensive plan. And there are differences between what they consist of, and we need to work all of that out, so that we can have these meetings and then go, and if it involves changes to the R1 district, then we can take those changes and we can go to town meeting and say, let's make these changes. Because that works out for all of the people that are involved and are interested in having it done.
Well,
Yes.
Donna, when you were talking about putting a buffer, because you've done a lot of thinking about this, what sort of number were you thinking of in your head?
Didn't have a number.
No number at all, like half a mile or a football field or?
David Bangor.
See, I guess, I see that as out of my area of expertise. The planners board can answer that question, I can't.
I was just thinking,
But-
in your vision to, what might,
Well,
reasonably be for,
One of the questions that I have had for a long time, as we had this issue on the table, is if you are in R4,
right?
your minimum lot size is 3 acres. And this is an exaggeration, but I'll use the phrase, you can do anything you want. Agriculturally, animal husbandry, wise, etc. If you're in R1 and you have 50 acres, you can't do on 50 acres what you could do on 3 acres in R4. So if we set a minimum lot size of R1, out of respect to the 1 acre lot owners and the higher density population, if we set a minimum number of acres such as 5 acres, or 10 acres, or 7.5 acres, that gives you a lot of leeway in terms of what your setback would be. And it's primarily side setbacks and rear setbacks that are gonna be the issue.
Well,
So,
'cause I
we
understand.
might be talking 100 feet, we might be talking 150 feet, I don't know. But, you know, that's certainly
Because
something.
I can
that we-
understand, especially with those folks that have the split things, and the cows don't know where the line is.
Well, I don't think it's probably the cows themselves that are the issue, it's the product of the cows that's the issue. But, and another piece of this, and one of the things that was discussed, and the proposal in June was discussed at public hearing, it's not just what you're doing on the land, it's how you're doing it. You can have one animal and be remarkably irresponsible about it and annoy your neighbors to death. Case in point, the dog that barks all night, all right? Or you can have 100 animals and be a very responsible farmer and nobody knows they're there. So that then becomes part of, we used to have a very short ordinance, about 10 pages long, and it relied on what was referred to as the good neighbor policy.
Right.
And a lot of issues can be worked out, as apparently that issue that Tad was just referring to, between neighbors. I wanna do this, it's going to upset all my neighbors, so I'm not gonna do this, because I don't wanna upset all my neighbors.
Are there other towns that have the same sort of issue? Do we know what they've done?
They all have this issue.
Yeah, but somebody
Anybody
is solving
resolve
it.
it?
I mean, we are not all by ourselves here. Can we learn lessons from other
Yes.
towns that are similar to us in character in terms of the pressures that are on us? I mean, are they doing it, or what can we learn from them?
A lot of them have very restrictive ordinances. Believe it or not, Arundel's ordinances are not as restrictive as our neighbors. Up and down the coast, they require a lot of things that we don't. Yeah, and I will admit, there are some of them that allow uses that we don't. But there's, you know, you start looking around, you look at Biddeford and Saco and Gray, and they've got some very restrictive ordinances out there.
But along that same line, I think Arundel is a different pot of tea,
Yeah.
because we are, I mean, I have people coming into Arundel and into the office and saying, that house in Kennebunkport my house is like half the size of this house and blah, blah, but we don't have oceanfront property and we don't have businesses that, and again, if we compare ourselves, we don't have a business district as, you know,
Center.
good, as well set
We're
as
not
we'd
the
like
center of
to,
town.
it's growing, but it's, we need SOAR, and that's coming, but that's gonna be a while before it comes. So if we compare ourselves to Gray or Biddeford or Saco, we are not Biddeford and Saco unless you get out into their rural areas. We're more like Lyman, Dayton, with a little bit of Kennebunkport or something like that, but we're not. So it's really hard to compare Arundel because we're a bedroom community with very little limited business district, and at the same time, we're very rural still in character.
It is
So-
difficult to compare, and I don't wanna look like Kennybunk or Biddeford
I
or
don't.
any of the surrounding communities.
This is
This
it.
is Arundel, we do have our own
And I
tax.
wasn't talking
Yeah.
about surrounding, I'm talking
But-
about Lyman,
Right.
Radford, they must have some of the same.
Right, that would be more, kind of the middle ground
Yes.
Yeah.
to look at would be, you know.
They have their own sets of issues.
Well,
That
just
Like
may be- that may be
everybody
true.
else, they
But
have
for-
their own sets of issues.
For all intents and purposes though, we're not gonna be like Saco, we're not gonna be like Biddeford ever, we're not trying to make Kennebunkport.
Look, Saco and Biddeford's issue is that their ordinance is similar to ours in that if it's an R1 district, it doesn't matter if it's on the outskirts of Biddeford, it doesn't matter if it's on the outskirts of any of the towns. R1 is R1. Those are the rules and it applies regardless of where you're located and regardless of whether or not you get service. We've got they've got the same problems, we've got those. We have a slightly different culture here in Arundel that we need to take into
It's
consideration.
starting to change.
It is starting to change.
With 4,000 people, it's a lot different now than what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago, and that's why we're in this dilemma.
And I hate to say, one of the things that we need to look at, I'm gonna pick on Susan. Susan moved here from the left coast. And she has a sizable investment, in her property. And we need to protect that, but we also need to protect my investment in my property, and your investment, and your investment. We need to protect the investment, all of us. Our houses are probably the most expensive thing we're ever going to own. And we need to make sure that the value on those homes doesn't go down because of changes that are made in the zoning ordinance.
Or changes that are not made.
Or changes that are not
in the
made.
ordinance.
Because we can do the same thing, and we can not do something and negatively impact a piece of property. Marty?
Yes, the also meeting with the comprehensive plan, I know we're talking of the R1, but there was also questions about joining the R3 and the R4 together.
That's all for a future discussion.
But I'm just saying,
Or
but
two.
the other question is also to ask is there anything allowing in the R1, being a landowner or anything else, per se, contract zone? I'm just throwing it out as a,
What's a contract zone?
Contract zone
Contract
is a
regard.
zone in which it's based on this, the proposed use, in which the town enters into a contract with the property or developer to develop a property in a manner that's not necessarily with that zone. Beg pardon? Well, the kind of just could, but we changed the zone. The contract zone would be putting, it would be something similar to that, where you would go into a contract, and you would have a agreed set of different design standards and different uses, and buffering and setbacks, and it's designed specifically for that use. It is not a floating zone anywhere, it is that use and that location. That's the contract between the town and the developer. The fear of, and we have proposed contract zones in the town, and the boards have decided that the better way to go is to, if somebody is very committed, like, a good example would be Kate's, is committed to moving to the town, that will go through the process of creating a new zone or creating new regulations for that zone to accommodate. Sometimes business moves much faster than having to wait a full year for a town meeting. And contract zone is one of the arrows in your quiver for doing development in a town in a manner that you want, or the planning board and the selectmen want, or more importantly, the townspeople, because there is an element in which the townspeople can vote for it, or the planning board and the selectmen vote for it.
There is something in the comprehensive plan about that, isn't it, somewhere, seems to me I remember that.
It was flexible, yeah, it was a flexibility, but I don't think we never referred to contract zones.
What's that?
We never referred to that as a contract zone. We also have planned unit developments, which is a very similar sort of thing, where a development is planned to be boarded through and can include mixed uses like agriculture, business, residential, recreation, and it's all in one particular development. Those are PUDs, you can do that, it can be huge, it can be small. We've explored that, but so far, residents decided not to go that route yet.
Through the chair,
Get you?
question for Mrs. Sikander, and if, let's take the example of the animal husbandry language that the planning board developed that was not voted on at town meeting. If that had specific, the matrix for the four zones and whatever, so is your suggestion to change it so that it ignores what the zone is, and instead is, if you have 1 to 3 acres, you're limited to this. If you have 10 acres and you do X, unless you have a buffer, then you can do X plus X times 2. Is that that part of what you're, I mean, is that kind of the direction you're thinking?
I think what the comprehensive plan suggests, well, let's, the sentence that has triggered all of this, or two sentences, small-scale agricultural and natural resource uses should be allowed with new agricultural uses subject to reasonable standards to protect adjacent residential areas. And that's key in terms of making sure that, you know, the change here doesn't upset the person who's already there. Animal husbandry, equestrian facilities, agritourism, and restricted contractor yard uses should be allowed, subject to conditions including minimum appropriate acreage requirements, minimized impact on surrounding lots due to odor, noise, and traffic, and required appropriate setback, screening, and buffering. And therein lies the protection for, in effect, both parties. What?
Page,
Oh, the ju-
Through the chair, can I, may I
Development
continue?
standards.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I quite answered your question yet. If we went from the standpoint of just, you know, looking at minimum acreage, again, 5 acres such as was suggested by the planning board last June, as long as you had 5 acres or more, you could do animal husbandry, equestrian facilities, et cetera, those listed things, with the proviso that you're not impacting your neighbors negatively. Does that answer your question?
Not exactly.
Okay.
My question was, should the ordinance provisions governing animal husbandry, how many animals, the density, et cetera, ignore the zoning district entirely? And what I think I heard was, yeah, it should just be based on how big the lot is and whether or not there's adequate setbacks. And am I hearing you incorrectly, or is that what you were saying?
I don't think I would phrase it that way. I don't like the word ignore in there, because I don't think there's an ignore happening, but in effect, yes. Okay?
I think that's outside the scope of what we're looking at, which is specifically the R1 section. We have a whole section on animal husbandry. When we get through the residential districts, if we want to address that issue, we can address it, but right now we're talking about the R1 district. Not something that would be town-wide at this point, because the purpose of this meeting is to discuss the R1 district.
But I don't think that's what Chip was doing. I think he was addressing the R1 district. In terms of,
I got the impression, he was asking you whether or not you take your suggestion and lay it over the entire town.
No, no, he was
That's the
saying
impression I
R1.
got from the
He was
question.
saying R1.
well, you can clarify that. Was he
Yeah.
referring just to
Oh,
R1?
no, oh, no,
He's
I
here.
absolutely was not referring specifically to R1.
Okay.
I was saying if the theory is that larger landowners should have different rights for smaller landowners, then let's ignore the zoning districts.
Ah, I understand now. And that's a dangerous phrase to use, because it's not a matter of whether you have more rights or less rights based upon the amount of land you have. The question is,
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. That's what he's saying.
That's what he's saying he wants to have.
No, no, Rich, no.
And I didn't understand.
No, what I was saying is that what I just expressed is a logical conclusion based on what I heard coming from the chairman of the comprehensive planning committee.
okay,
That wasn't what I heard from your question, so I apologize.
let me put your thought in a different light. If I have, let me just get myself in the right place here. If I have property in R3, and you have property in R1, as a conditional use, I can put in a campground and you can't. Does that mean I have more rights than you?
Clearly.
I think we
It
might,
means that I have more permitted uses or conditional uses based upon the zone. but it's not a matter of right, because as soon as you use the word rights, that's a trigger.
So take that word out, let's dispense with that word.
Yes.
Go with yours, all right, because it's gonna end up the
Try
same place.
flexibility.
Yeah.
Exactly, more options, more flexibility, then yes, absolutely. If you have a larger piece of land, if you have a 1 acre piece of land, if it's permitted, you cannot put in a football stadium. I defy you to do that.
But what happens if you have 400 acres in an R1? You still can't put in a football stadium.
Not under the current ordinance.
Unless the ordinance allows it as a permitted use or as a conditional use. And I think that's what we ultimately need to decide here. What are appropriate permitted and conditional uses in R1?
In what is supposed to be a highly residential.
Right, you gotta go back to
You
what
have to
Tom.
look at what the comp plan said for R1, and that is a highly dense populated area. So we have to look at what is appropriate for that.
For that neighborhood.
Not for
But
what we
Tom
would
was saying,
like
just
to be
because you
able
got
to-
large piece of land doesn't mean that you can have a football stadium. What's the effect of everybody else around?
Correct.
Right.
That's what you gotta look
Tom?
at.
I think, even though we're talking about, the R1 district, I think this, whatever concepts we talk about will apply to R2 and R3.
They will.
Because if someone had 50 acres in the R2,
Could have the
why,
same
yeah,
discussion.
it should be the same thing. So in effect, that becomes town-wide, whatever we, based on the size of the acreage, whatever applies to one zone will be similar to all the zones.
I would tend to think that R1 should be the most restrictive zone. And then it goes up from there. R2 can do all of this plus what R1.
Yeah.
R3 can do all of this plus R1 and R2. To me, that would make a little more sense. You'd have more land, you'd be able to do more. But R1 would be, for lack of a better term, the most restrictive, because it's supposed to be a highly densely populated area. And you wanna make sure that those people, that first off, that we can develop it that way, and secondly, that the people who have purchased property and moved in there are protected. Mark?
Yes, I'm in R1, we've accumulated over the years close to 350 acres of the best topsoil in that area. We've had the Land for Maine's Future come down, take soil samples for it. It's now been brought into a trust for perpetuity, there'll never ever be a house on that land. So I mean, to kind of say, what's the priority? My priority in life has already been stated, it's gonna stay there, it's found, there'll never be any development there.
Right, it will
From
never
the-
be
from
a
the-
highly densely
So,
populated area.
we need protection that we can have cattle there, and the next generation can take over. When you say
But
priorities,
you already have them.
well, we do, we don't.
You know, what's gonna happen, we can't impact your neighbors negatively, and that's part of the problem that everybody has.
We have no
You
neighbors.
don't now.
We never
Well, how
will.
will we?
Can
We
you
all,
guarantee that you will never have neighbors?
Yes, other than who's
Yeah.
already there, yes.
With the exception of owning all of the land in the
Well-
town of Arundel, you cannot guarantee
well,
that.
we own from the Kennebuck River, the middle of the Kennebuck River, to Eastern Trail,
Okay,
to the main turnpike,
yep,
and to the cottages.
okay.
So,
So, I mean, there's not, the
There's-
cottages are happy with us.
But that's a small portion of the town of Arundel. It's just a swath that runs right through the R1. You can't guarantee that at some point in the future, the people that are in Talbot Woods, I'll pick on them because that's the only one I can think of. What happens if you do something that adversely impacts them?
well, they can move out.
Adversely impact
You can move
their
out.
property. And that's the conundrum that planning boards and comp plans face. How do we make sure,
If we meet all the setbacks for odor,
that's right,
yeah, and we do now.
and you,
We're state approved for compost facilities.
but that's what I said.
Yeah.
You're allowed to do that now, because you've met all of the requirements.
But I wanna point something out, and I just can't help but say this, but, we had all that would have been allowed everything that you were looking for on your property.
Original.
Along- No, now,
No.
we had some that we sent to the town meeting, and not just your property, but throughout the town, if you had enough acreage with setbacks, you could do all this. But for some reason, it was really torn apart before people, I think before people even read what you're now asking for again. So, I'm not sure what the planning board can do, except to almost show you what, maybe have you all read it and say, yeah, that's what we're all talking about. We are so close to what I'm hearing everybody talking about right now.
But that only addresses the one area.
Right.
There's,
Well,
there's everything else in town. And we will get to that point where we will end up addressing this again, and we can go over all of that. But it's, at some point, we have to look at all of the various uses and decide what's going to happen. What are we going, this list, what are we gonna allow? What's gonna be a conditional use? The other thing you have to understand, and this is gonna create a great deal of angst, I'm sure, if you're not on this list, it's not allowed. The ordinance says that if it is not a permitted or conditional use, it is not allowed.
Mr. Chair, question?
You know,
Example, okay, property owner, before any zoning came in, it was a working farm. Okay? Now, since then, the farm might have changed hands, but is still restricted by what they can do.
Is it, the question for that, Marty, and you know better, the issue for that is how long has it been since it was a farm? If it's been 30 or 40 years since it was a farm, I'm sorry, it hasn't been a farm. If it had been 2 years, and we could always make the argument, well, it's been 3 years. That's a different argument than at one point in time, my great-great-grandfather farmed a piece of property on Thompson Road, probably wasn't there then, but, you know, he had a farm going, I should be allowed to continue that farm. That's a completely different argument.
But it's also an irrelevant argument.
Thank you.
No problem. From the standpoint of, again, reasonable use of the land, if you have a piece of property sufficiently large so that you can, in this case, begin farming again without adversely affecting your neighbors, what possible rationale do you have for not allowing that?
I can think of one rationale is the voters of this town, maybe 40 years, 35 years ago, voted to have it this way. So,
I'll comment on that one.
and it, not only did they vote for it, but kind of lived with it, with few issues that have lived with it until the last 4 or 5 years. And so it's something that none of us probably really intentionally tried to restrict, but
Okay.
the voters did approve of that.
So we've gotten a little bit off track. Just this one. So let's take a look at the permitted uses list that we have.
Mr. Chair, may I make a suggestion?
Sure.
We have a document in front of us that the compounding community did a lot of work on. And the voters of this town did in fact approve. And this is really the guiding platform which we should probably launch from in the beginning. Because these are the recommendations that have been made for this particular district. And they're rather specific, and they're not too many huge deviations from some of the things that are already on here. And perhaps we should just review what the general objective is for the district, and what the uses that are proposed should be for the district. And maybe that way we won't start going off onto some philosophical direction that it's not really relevant to this district. I think it might be relevant to other districts, but this district is pretty cut.
If I look at this, and it's on the uses, residential uses are allowed at a density of 1 dwelling unit per acre. Allowed residential uses will include single and 2-family homes as well as multifamily dwellings. Permitted non-residential uses include community and government uses, non-commercial recreational facilities, and home occupations of businesses. Additionally, age-restricted housing, congregate care facilities, small-scale agriculture and natural resource uses, animal husbandry, equestrian facilities, agritourism, and restricted contractor storage yards will be permitted in accordance with accepted development standards.
And perhaps we should read the beginning too, which is really states the goal for the whole district.
The goal for the whole district, residential district one, along with any adjacent mixed-use districts, is intended to create the potential for development of quality, high-density residential neighborhoods, encouraging pedestrian-oriented connections and access to local businesses and services. And where feasible, boundaries of this district should follow lot lines. And then it says to look at the map for the various locations. The pedestrian-oriented connections and the high-density residential neighborhoods are where we tripped up. If you look at if you compare the uses to what is currently allowed, I think a lot of the permitted uses would go away. I'm not sure you could fit them into this classification. There are some in this classification that would get added in, but I'm not sure that you could fit all of the current uses in there. Mark?
Being selfish for a minute, just one time in my life I've been selfish, how's this gonna affect,
I'm shocked.
how's that gonna affect the farming that we're trying to do in that area, in R1? If we don't wanna develop and we're not gonna develop, how is that gonna affect?
It's not, Mark, it's not gonna affect you at all.
Okay,
It's not gonna affect you for two reasons. One, you're grandfathered, and two, the land can never be used for anything else. You've already set it into a trust, it can't be,
alright.
well, that's assuming that the courts don't decide otherwise, but that's a different issue.
Isn't R1 single-family housing?
Supposedly.
And so there were many categories on the list you just read that are not R1. So
Yeah.
is that a misnomer?
This is what the comprehensive plan wants to see in the R1 and the way it is designed.
And incidentally, that is not a recent change, that has been there for a long time. The only, the past amendments that were made really only apply to the small-scale animal husbandry, equestrian facilities, agritourism, restricted contractor yard uses. We were trying to open up the possibilities for those people who had larger tracts of land. But the single and multifamily dwellings, none of that was changed.
Because what we had to do is we had to take a look at what was happening, and while we as a town can try to dictate where we want growth to go, those of us that have lived here for a long time know that we can try to dictate, but that does not necessarily mean that's what's gonna happen. When I first moved here, it was 2 acres across the whole town. I've been through, I don't even know how many comprehensive plans, I've sat on at least 3 so far. It's a document that kind of grows with your town. It's supposed to be something that's flexible. I have to say, the first one that I did was pretty much a dictatorship, because we didn't really have a big comprehensive plan. I'm not even sure we had one when we did the first one. But you had to have it done, it had to be done by this date, it had to be sent to the state. So what happened in essence, because when I moved here 37, almost 38 years ago, we didn't have tiny lots, we had a lot more agriculture than we had today. And in essence, when we changed it to smaller lots in Route 1, although I don't think that that was ever the intent of the Comprehensive Planning Committee, might have been the intent of the state or the planning committee at the time, but it wasn't our intent. But in reality, what we did, which is what other people talk about is people's property rights, is that we actually restricted what people could do in those areas where they could do them before. They may not have been doing them, but anyone who's watched the news lately knows that small farming, food that is grown without chemicals is becoming a big deal. People are probably doing more farming now than when I moved into town. Probably not as many dairy farms, but I think farming in different forms, I think is probably bigger than when I moved here. And I think what we looked at is there a way that we can develop our standards to allow people who own big pieces of land that got restricted when the acreage changed not once but twice, and allow them to be able to do things because of the size lot they have. Now, people can say, well, big landowners can do other things that other people can't do. I don't look at it that way. I look at it in the fashion that they were allowed to do this at one time and we restricted what they could do. We wanted all the growth in that area, but those that live in that area, I can tell you, the growth is out by me. And I think I'm in the R4, okay? They're all building out by me, and why? Because they don't wanna be on little tiny lots. They wanna be more out in the country. I don't know if it's that far out of the country anymore, but that's what we were aiming for. We were not aiming to give large property owners rights, or to give take away small property owners' rights. What we were simply doing is taking some direction from comments and people that had spoken to us, and saying, is there any way that we can get to a compromise to be able to allow people who have the land to be able to do these things, to do them, without having to come back to the town and try to change an ordinance every time they wanna change something. Because as a small town, things in this town happen slowly. Now, I might get frustrated with it sometimes, but in some respects, sometimes things that happen slowly end up with a better product. And I'll give you two. They're not in R1. Kate's Butter took us, 2 years to finish the ordinances for that? Seasonal cottages, we met weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, daily, for like 2.5 years. So sometimes if a project makes sense for the town, you have to find a way to accomplish it. And so this is simply what we were doing, is we wanted to open up the door and say, is there a way to do this? And make everybody happy. So if you have a small lot, you like the small lot, that's fine. But if somebody already owned 200 acres in the R1, and they don't intend to build houses on it, thank you very much, I appreciate it. Because his 200 or 300 acres cost me nothing. But if you take those 300 acres and you subdivide them into 50 million houses, then I'm paying $14,000 or $16,000 for every single kid in every single one of those houses. And I know that it sounds cruel to people who have kids. I have one. So I know how much it costs. I also know how much school costs. So I think what we were trying to do is not take away people's property rights, not try to say that somebody deserved more rights. I think what we were saying is, we are a unique town who tries to respect everybody that lives in it. And so, is there a way to make it so that everyone has their property rights? And as much as best as we can we make it better for everybody? So you make the regulations so that you make it so somebody can't have a 1 acre, and I'm just gonna use that as an example, have 1 acres and have a pig farm. And I know pigs, if you take care of them, don't smell, but that's the one that comes up at every one of our meetings, is about pigs. No, that's not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is, we're looking for the 200-300 acre people who wanna continue the tradition that's been in this town forever, and what started this town, and what made us separate from Kennebunkport. So that's what we were aiming for. We're not aiming to put a Walmart in R1. That's not what we were looking for.
Mr. Chair, you just say, I don't think anybody disagrees with any of that. I'm wondering if we can get a sense of the consensus so we can move forward. Is anybody opposed to having large, and if we wanna go with large acres, how do we then, next step, how do we go about setting the design standards?
I find myself agreeing with Donna. If you have a large lot and you have appropriate setbacks, and it is a conditional use, then there are certain things that could be allowed. And I say it's a conditional use because otherwise we would have to spell out exactly what it is that you can do on every piece of property, and that would be overwhelming.
And that was the intent, they should be
If we had
conditional.
conditional uses, and the standards were such that they were buffered enough, then yes, I could probably look at that and say, okay, we can, I think the thing we have to do is find consensus, because I disagree with Diane. We're not gonna make everybody happy. There's no way this side of the Golden Gates that we can make everybody happy. All we can do is work to reach consensus around something that says, this is a good document, and it is something that we can get behind. So, you know, if we're gonna do that, I'd like to say you start at 10-acre lot and work your way from there, but we work around and building up some kind of a consensus and get setbacks in there and do all of the other fun stuff that have to be done. But then that still brings us back to a couple of questions.
Sure.
Pedestrian oriented. Joan?
Well, before we get to pedestrian, which we is part of the goal also to try and get these things to match up? The uses, because I see permitted uses and conditional uses, and then I see the comp plan uses.
And they're not the same, they're not even
No,
close.
is that part of our
Yes.
purview, to
Yes.
get those, okay,
Yes, it is.
great.
And I'm so glad that you made it, and we need to get more of the ACT people involved, because it talks about pedestrian-oriented connections. And if we could find some way to get these lots connected, I'll be the first one. If you can get the people on either side of me to agree, I'll give you 50 feet of my land for a walking trail along Duck Brook. I don't care.
Make
That's
that
6.5
ready, please, Rich. Leave
I
that
got
ready.
6.5 acres, I don't use it, I walk back there and I hang out, and I think it's wonderful.
Can we pasture it off?
Huh?
Can we pasture it off?
No, it's treed, it's completely treed, and I love it that way, but I can't build anything on it anyway.
We would love to be part of that, because I think, other than the 3 pieces of land and the 2 sets of trails that we're doing, there's no
But you,
places really to walk
and
safely.
your organization is the organization that could make that happen, by making the contacts with people and talking about getting things going.
Part of that, let me get into that pedestrian-oriented connections, it wasn't just, I love the trails and everything, but I think some of the focus too was in developments. I think one of the developments we were looking at was Bartlett Farms.
Yeah.
And you take that intersection where, the new road and Old Alfred Road, and you've got used to have a little store there,
Right.
things like that. And then you've got Bartlett Farms, and we wanted to make sure that if you were going to do it, again, they wound up with an exit now on the Liberty Acres area.
Yep.
So if you could do these type of things where if you're gonna develop something, if you could get one development to connect to another development perhaps in the back, not necessarily come out on road frontage, but into the back of the developments and get them to have somehow connect, you could have people walking like to a corner store or walking through the development for pedestrian, just exercise without being on 111 or on the Old Alfred Road or something. And I think that was part of our pedestrian-oriented connections, was connecting the developments and making them accessible if you had little.
We have talked about
Yeah.
that. We've even talked about it from a road point of view, where if you build a development, and you put in a cul-de-sac at the very end of the cul-de-sac, you need to leave room or a connector to the development that comes.
Right, and I think that's important.
Another piece of that was because R1 and the Alfred Road district, as a mixed-use district, were connected, that was another piece of the pedestrian connection, in terms of what Simone just referenced, having a corner store. I know people who would kill to have a corner store. Apparently some of them are in this room. But, encouraging that kind of development in the mixed-use district to tie into the nearby residential areas. So that's what that was about.
And I think from ACT's perspective, and that's something we've talked about, it's not just trails through the woods, and just get close to nature, it's to bring the neighborhoods together, the community together. I mean, wouldn't it be lovely to be, even if you wanted to walk down to the mall, and you put your life in your hands trying to walk down 111, there's no, but places that we have known, if we can build that
Can't even
into
mow
it,
your lawn without fear of them coming and get you.
yeah, we'd be happy to be part of that.
Oh,
Madam Chair,
People do.
Yeah, Marty?
question. Listening to everything else, and with the soil conditions and everything else along the way, as we were just explaining it along the old Limerick Road, should that actually not be an R1 lot size? Should that actually be an R2, so that it could be utilized more?
Yeah, I think you'll be hard pressed at this point to change
I'm
people's
just
language.
throwing that out as a usage and like I said, for, if you have more Harvey home farmers growing and everything else, that 1 acre with the house and everything else along the way, it's pretty hard to do. I mean, I'm just throwing it out, that's all it is.
It's outside the purview of the purposes for these meetings.
It's a
We
thought,
don't have the,
that's all.
if the comp plan wants to do that, that's up to the comp plan. We can't make those changes.
It's
But
saying
if the
we
planning
made it.
board recommends to the
That's
comp
right.
plan committee that they would like to see these
Well, I
tweaks,
think we should
That
first
would be
get through and
something,
come up
you
with
know.
whatever the designs and the information that we wanna
Yeah,
have
you
in.
need to figure out the uses here.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think
That's
we
what this
have
meeting
to,
is supposed to be
right, I think we have to
about.
concentrate on the things that are already there
Yeah.
before we make new things, because then we're never gonna get anything done.
Yeah, it's been 2 years since we did this, and this really isn't that part of the district. It gets harder later on.
Through the chair.
So, I think under these circumstances, maybe we should look at some of the uses here, which are residential uses, that the comp plan committee has targeted for this district. Because some of these uses are very high density uses, and in fact, we're talking about density standards here, which include density bonuses for doing cluster development. Obviously for preserving open space. And, that is one of the big issues that's in here, is not only just to have this as a dense residential area that allows other natural resource uses, but to do it in a way that preserves open space and some of the rural character that we keep talking about in this town. We keep saying we wanna preserve rural character, but I'll tell you right now, if we keep going the way we're going right now,
Nothing left.
developing along all the roads, with no controls, the rural character is already going, and so.
Not into it.
I think that's.
So, and again, this will be the last comment that I make, because Arundel is certainly not Los Angeles, and I didn't come here to find and help you build another Los Angeles.
Thank you.
I do come from a family of developers, and, I'm sure you've all been looking at this of what the future portends for the community of Arundel. And Marty's sighing, and I may be the future as opposed to the past. And you want people to walk to growth areas that are commercial and, encourage, more single-family development, families and whatever, and maybe not children, but, other things. So you have all of Route 1 and you wanna drive development along there for residences and things like that, and that enable people to live close by and get to Route 1, but still protect the rural, character of, for instance, where I live on the Senate Road, past Vinegar Hill, and I don't have any problem with Vinegar Hill or any of the people that are around me that have different uses, including, Chip is behind me, and I haven't heard a cow once, and since I've been there, but that's fine too. So, all I'm saying is that, not a single cow, actually. You have to figure, and I know you're thinking about this, and I'm thinking about it too, because now I have a significant investment here. And, if you wanna drive more density, drive it closer to 111 and get that developed in Arundel so that more people wanna cluster here, they wanna spend their money here, they wanna eat here, they wanna shop here, they wanna do whatever. But not necessarily smack dab in the middle of some, you're near you or near me or whatever. And so, I'm hearing all of this stuff, but to me, whatever the uses, conditional uses are for R1 should be very targeted and very specific. Even more, much more specific than what you've got now, and maybe you need a subcategory or an overlay for people like, is it Mark?
Yes.
Yes, for
But
Mark.
That's the purpose of this meeting,
Well,
to
so,
define all of these items.
I think we need to figure that out, because there is an application and a connection between a huge, metropolitan area like a Los Angeles and Arundel, because for a long time, they didn't plan their development, and it ended up very cattywampus.
Having just come back from Anaheim, oh yeah.
Yes, but the whole area, if you've ever heard of the Grove, that became very conscious in terms of younger people wanted to be able to walk with their children and eat and have coffee and shop and do all of these things. And so they built all these townhouses and rental things and whatever to encourage development along a corridor like Route 1. And not that we need a Grove or anything like that, or another development where Kohl's is and Walmart and everything else. But there are smaller applications that sort of fulfill that need in a community more than a country store could make it in an area where, for instance, New Road is and Alfred Road and all those places intersect. So all I can say is
I think in effect, we have done that, because if you, as some homework, read the whole comprehensive plan. We're looking at one little piece of it. But we also have mixed-use districts, which are intended to fulfill exactly that. So they're already targeted, it's just a matter of having it happen. Our immediate problem, unfortunately, is sorting out, at the moment, R1. And the discrepancy between the approved comp plan and the current land use ordinance.
And we can,
I understand that, but some of the uses, even in R1, sound to me, given my experience coming from another place, belong in another.
And they very well be right,
That's-
yes.
that's part of what
Yeah.
we're going to be looking at. And we may get to the point, where we say to the comp plan, here, we have a recommendation for you, change R1. This stuff needs to go out of it. So it would give them,
Something to do?
Reason to meet.
but it would, we can't make those changes. We could always say, let's just go to town meeting with a recommendation, but it should actually come from the comp plan and not the planning board.
To that point, I would just keep in mind that the statute requires simply that your uses be not inconsistent with what's in the comp plan. You don't have to mirror it.
That's true.
So you don't necessarily have to change the comp plan to do what you want to do.
I actually think some of the uses that we have are inconsistent with what the comp
Those should
plan
be,
says.
those are, that we identify those, and let's move on, let's do it.
So,
Rich, please, through the chair.
Chip has been chafing at the bit.
I've not been chafing it a bit, I've just been waiting a while. Tad touched on something I think is very important, which is that the subdivision ordinance fits hand in glove with some respects, specifically cluster housing. And I am going to raise a question about R1, where you have 1 acre zoning already. What the cluster housing allows is half acre lots with, yes, open space, but I think we have a recent example where the open space is off the road and not not usable or visible by anybody. And what we end up with is a little patch of New Jersey with the half acre lots. And I question, I wanna throw out the question about should cluster housing, does cluster housing with half acre lots fit with well, let me put it differently. In my mind, it doesn't fit with what Arundel is or what I want Arundel to be. And I wanted to throw that out. Another question I have, it's very specific, since I have the floor for a moment, is multifamily housing, just generic multifamily housing. What benefit is an apartment building to anybody else in Arundel? It's not generating enough tax revenue to cover any kids that might live there. It's a high intensity use. Is that something that should be included in R1?
Can I respond to that? I think you could ask what benefit is a single family house as well. But if you call it like a tenement building, nobody wants to have that next door. But if you call it a townhouse complex, like in Kennebunk, they're all over the place. They're condos, townhouses, and that is more appealing. And it would still have to have at least a half acre density requirement, or 1 acre if they didn't have open space. As far as the open space goes, it's not just to provide rural character, it's also to provide habitat for wildlife. And if we did fill it all in evenly, 1 acre, 1 acre, 1 acre, there's no place for wildlife to really live. So it's nice to set aside some land for the wildlife, as well as providing the rural character that visually the rural character can be a facade, it looks rural, but behind the bushes, there's tons of houses. So you can maybe have both of that.
It sounds terrible.
And I think it depends on how the subdivision is done, because I know the little one, Fairway Drive down my way is, you don't really see it from the road. It's got 10 or whatever little houses and a large area of open space. You never know it's there, and it's got, nice little homes on, I don't know, a little more than less than an acre lot, and they've got a good open space in the back that abuts other large landowners, which is, always abundant with wildlife. And I think, as opposed to these little open spaces that surround it, that doesn't do anything, So I think if it's properly done, it can make
We
a
need some
difference.
standards for how that should be.
So we're talking about
I'm sorry,
design standards here for
Right,
open
those are
space
design
preservation.
standards, as opposed to saying, yeah, we're going to allow them in the R1 or the R2 or wherever. Those are design standards, and that's something that the planning board would be developing.
Through the chair, if I may, unless I'm mistaken, the cluster housing is actually required by the current land use ordinance. It's not optional. And I am challenging that requirement if we're gonna be talking about uses in R1.
And can I address that? I think one of the things that I know further down in the comp plan, I think in maybe the R4, I'm not sure. One of the issues that's been addressed is the fact of giving somebody the option to either,
In R1.
it's in R1, oh, okay, it's in R1. Where are we now? What page?
It's large lot subdivisions.
Yeah, as an alternative to the clusters.
That's not,
It would be 10-acre subdivisions, 10-acre lots.
Which
it's
is
not in the comp
completely
plan
not viable from a financial perspective in a zone where you got 1 acre lots.
Yeah, because we had believed in like the possibility of gentleman farms, and if you have a 40-acre parcel and you wanna sell it into 4 10-acre lots to make a gentleman's farm, you have that option as opposed to
Yeah,
having to
okay.
cluster it.
It is, yeah.
It is.
It is right there in the front, it's just that when you read through it,
Oh, okay, so.
that preserve open space by utilizing either clustering or creating a subdivision containing lots of 10 acres or more.
So that was part of our plan, was to allow that, so anybody with a, like a 50-acre parcel could have, produce like maybe 5 gentleman farms of 10-acre lots, or cluster it, but not have to cluster it,
Not on a 50 acre lot, they wouldn't do it.
Well, probably 50 plus acres.
But,
No, the town can build those and maintain them during the winter, right?
Through the chair,
I'm only teasing.
from just a financial perspective, somebody who owns 50 acres of land, and they have an alternative, the alternative of creating 50 half-acre lots through cluster subdivision and having 25 acres of open space, lots which in today's market would sell for somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. Or they could sell 5 lots of this. I think at the very least, the large lot acreage needs to be looked at, but I repeat, to me, in R1, where the cluster housing ends up with half-acre lots, that's where I lived in suburbia. And I personally don't, what I saw in my tenure on the planning board did not result in preserving rural character.
Which the R1 isn't necessarily.
R1 is not, R1 is a dense residential neighborhood. So, but it's one of those things that we will end up having to look at. So let's take a look at, right now, permitted uses. Okay, and see whether or not we can get something, we have a little bit of time. So the very first one is an accessory structure. Basically, we're talking a garage, a shed, something that you have, other than the house.
A barn for non-commercial use,
Could be, yes, could be.
an artist studio, an architect's studio, an accountant,
Well,
a lawyer,
it depends on
or
whether or not,
lawyers, no.
it depends on whether or not you have a home occupation, and whether or not the home occupation is allowed.
No lawyers?
You know, so I lived in a town, I was an accountant for 45 years, I lived in a town where you could not have a home occupation. You could be a doctor and you could be a dentist, but you could not be anything else and have a home occupation, which was nuts.
But now with telecommuting and everything like that, so many people.
Yes, I don't have to leave it all now. But that is an accessory structure. It's ancillary to the fact that you've got the house. I have an accessory structure, I have a shed in the back of my house.
Home occupation is what you're saying. And that's what
So, there's no problem with number one.
So that's,
Accessory use becomes a question. What do we mean by accessory use?
yeah, what's the definition of that?
Well, it's like reasonable, it's very nebulous, what is reasonable mean? Your reasonable
Well-
and my reasonable to be, Tom would have to arbitrate that and decide.
No,
Help us
he'd
decide
have to
what's
arbitrate
reasonable.
between our
Well, of course, this is conceptual, folks, we're working on the details now, so this is.
Do we have a definition in,
Accessory, well, and here it says accessory use or structure. A use or structure which is customarily incidental and subordinate to the principal use or structure.
Right.
Accessory uses or structures when aggregated shall not subordinate, please, who wrote this?
I
Shall not s- No, we didn't, it's your definition.
I can make a guess based on, but then she'd have to go home and tell her
Right.
husband.
A deck or a deck or similar extension of the principal structure or garage attached to the principal structure by a roof or common wall is considered part of the principal structure. So accessory is separate. Accessory use, I guess, is just whatever you're doing in your separate building.
Yes, it would be.
So it's like a 3-story bird bath. Okay.
A garden
Yeah, but-
shed, keep your tractors in.
But can you rent that accessory building?
No.
No,
But does it say that in the ordinance?
It has to be. It has to be, what was the word, subordinate?
Yes, subordinate to.
Of course.
Well, subordinate, subordinate means that what, you can't live there?
but if you rent it, if you
You
rent
could
it,
rent it
then
as an
that's no
office.
longer, that's no longer associated with your residential use. Now you're using it for something not associated with the property.
How about Airbnb use?
Same thing.
Yeah.
Rental Airbnb.
Another 2 months.
Actually,
Sam,
Sam, given my.
I have my own.
Rewind, erase.
Basically, I would just think,
Okay.
Actually, sorry.
Number 3,
perhaps maybe just combine them.
One is, yeah, we could combine, we could go accessory use, accessory structure slash use, and make it combined.
Which is your definition.
that's the definition, yeah.
So that takes one off the list.
So if you add personal use?
There's no reason to add personal use. It's your home, you can use it,
Right. Okay.
okay?
I'm sorry.
And in my case, I have a shed,
No, I understand,
I
I'm building
use it
one too,
personally,
but I'm just
I
saying.
store stuff in it. I store stuff in it because I can't quite get my wife to say I can take it to the junk yard.
Agriculture.
Throw it away.
Okay, moving on.
Agriculture.
Thank you.
Agriculture.
Sure.
Growing of crops.
With condition, agriculture.
That's permitted.
It is, it is permitted. I think it
Combine
should it be conditional? So that we can put restrictions on it and say, you've gotta buffer it, you've gotta do this, you've gotta do that.
This is growing tomatoes, come on, this is a backyard garden. If you make that conditional, you will have an uprising.
Agriculture is for commercial purposes, that is the definition. Agricultural use is for the commercial, production of foodstuffs or basically vegetable matter.
Hay.
Personal farm
It's
gardens,
fun.
It has nothing to do with that.
It's fine.
That's
vegetable
personal.
gardens,
This
that's.
is for
Personal?
commercial purposes.
But this isn't personal though.
No, this
Agriculture
definition is
Commercial.
commercial.
Are you allowed to have the
It's
farm?
the same
I
thing
can
with
get
animal
front yard.
husbandry, it's for commercial.
I can sell my bale of hay or I can sell my tomato.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you allowed to have your farm stand there? So
Farm
that's
stand is a
1 acre
lot.
lot, so you're raising agriculture?
Farm stand is something that can be done with just a building permit from.
That's a home occupation, home business.
No.
How do you
Temporary
define the
use.
commercial?
Allowed for-
How do we know that that's just for?
Commercial is if you get any financial gain.
That's why we found.
If I
So
sell
you
my
give it away
tomatoes, I
free.
have a financial gain, don't
That's
tell
right.
me.
Like
If
your
you sell
flowers.
them on the market or if you sell your eggs, yes, that's financial gain. That's where the,
And-
that's, quite frankly, I'm not trying to plug, but that's where the animal husbandry thing, they put a cap, or a minimum amount that had to be.
Fairly
put-
high.
A fairly high one too.
I would be quite honest and tell you, I look at agriculture, and if you tell me agriculture is commercial, I disagree that it belongs in the R1. I've had that position from day one. I believe the R1 should be residential. If you have a home occupation, I have no problem with that.
But again, you get into your large landowners.
20 acres there.
Then you make it a conditional use, and you
You will have a
define
rebate.
what it's going to look like, as opposed to saying it is permitted.
It will
So
not
if
pass.
you live on your 20 acre parcel and farm it, is that a home occupation?
No, if it's for commercial gain, no. What are you farming it for?
What are you being an accountant as a home occupation for?
Well, I've never been one, so I don't
No,
know.
I'm posing, you know.
It's
You
a
were just
valid point,
farming it,
but
Jimmy, that would be an accessory use, right? You're not selling it under,
Right.
product, that's an accessory use, so
Right.
you're already covered.
So is farming allowed, Tom?
No,
Is farming allowed to make a living off the land?
it's not farming, it's agriculture,
It's
it's different.
agriculture,
That's
it's
fine.
cultivation of soil, producing or raising crops, including gardening, it's
So
a
that's
commercial
allowed.
operation.
as a commercial
It's just
operation.
allowed, it's allowed right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And- But to me, that's the kicker, it's as a commercial operation.
No,
I don't
it's-
think-
How about when you just put in
Yourself.
parentheses,
No, I don't think it
commercial,
was ever the intent.
I'm sorry, I was talking first, thank you. Agriculture, put in parentheses, commercial, move it down to conditional use.
I like that.
I don't
I don't either.
I object.
It's still,
Well, all right,
You're a Mason.
I keep coming back to the first piece of my thinking in this, and if you are doing an agricultural operation on your, 1 acre, 2 acres, 5 acres, doesn't matter. Let's say you're raising tomatoes and that's your crop, you sell them, what adverse effect could that have on your neighbors? None.
it actually could.
It could.
If I live next door and they're starting up at 6:30 and they're just plowing and they have workers out there, it's not a
You got
residential.
the migrants
it's-
coming up,
it-
picking the
Yeah.
tomatoes.
The residential people are already going to work, thank you very much.
Maybe there's a dollar amount attached to how much you make from what you grow.
I don't
that-
want to
that
get into
separates
investigating
it.
and auditing.
No,
how
no,
much
I
people
totally
make.
agree, I'm just saying, between a home enterprise and something that's bigger.
I think agriculture for commercial gain should be a conditional use.
I think ultimately, in the social climate that we have, to start to restrict, restrict agricultural uses in any zone is gonna be a pointless endeavor.
Yep.
And, we might as well just
They were
spend
going
another
right
hour
for
and
our
40
roots.
minutes just talking to each other. Because,
So if I have a garden and I have extra tomatoes and I have extra cucumbers and I put something at the end of my driveway, 5 cents or whatever, what's the difference between that and what Mark's doing?
Nothing.
How about if my income is based on 100%? My income is 100% from farming. You may be a janitor.
Don't make
or-
those distinctions.
There is no?
Selling it for
No.
commercial purposes.
No.
It's not your success level, it's not how much
No, shouldn't be.
you sell it, then it's commercial operation.
It's like
And my point is, to me, that should be allowed in the R1.
Right now it is.
Plain and simple.
scale is not the issue.
Next one.
I'm used to losing that
Is
argument.
scale the issue? Do
Can I
you want a
say-
huge greenhouse operation or something like Snell's out in Buxton or some of the
Yep.
other, that have people come in there all day long,
Which
every day of the week?
It's a lot.
You-
Then you're not gonna have that on 1 acre, are you?
You might.
But
But
you
you
could still
you
have
posited
it.
the position that we have a 40-acre parcel in R1.
All right,
And
and
you
if,
could do it then.
if that's the
Now,
case,
maybe that's fine, but
if
that's
that's the
something.
case, then you have the acreage to support that
That
level of
becomes a
operation.
condition.
But now you got traffic to deal with, and if it's a permitted use, they don't have to go to the
They
planning
don't
board
have
for
to-
any.
It should be a conditional use.
However, the famous word in all land use, however, we do have something that's not even in here, because we've done it since then, and that is the farm stand, the farm retail. And the farm retail is a conditional use, and it does require exactly what you're talking about. If we did have Snell's Farm or Gillespie's Farm or Maxwell's,
Right.
that if they put it in a span like that, then it's a whole different
Yeah.
ballgame. But you're right, there's intensity, there's levels of scale.
Yeah, all right.
Can I just add something to Jamie's comment about that wouldn't fly in Arundel? We tried, I remember a while, I don't know, this is many, many years ago, but, they were changing some of the zoning on Route 1 and said agriculture was not in the zone, meaning commercial agriculture. The day before, or a couple of days before town meeting, someone circulated papers all over town saying, do you know that if you live on Route 1, you will not be able to have a garden in Arundel anymore? And so that's the concept that's gonna go out there, is that you're limiting my use of, my garden space, because agriculture to everybody in town is a little something different, and, I totally agree with Jamie that,
Just put
Particularly
commercial in.
today, when you're allowed to grow so many different varieties of plants.
Yeah.
Correctly put.
but if your farm retail is limiting what you can sell agriculturally, I think that kind of regulates
Why
it.
don't you just change the definition, have agriculture, have agriculture, don't have it commercial, you can cultivate, raise crops, including the garden,
And
take
then
commercial, and
commercial
have another
agriculture.
definition for commercial agriculture.
That's
It's a
good.
condition.
But that's what we have. We have the definition in here for farm retail, which would include the
That
sale
maybe it's as
of,
simple as saying that, agriculture, commercial.
agriculture, as I
seed.
read the definition, is the production side of things, not the sale, green, you know.
But I think there, Jerry, I think that there's a third place in that it could be large scale, greenhouses, it could be a 3-acre, greenhouse. That's not retail, they might be.
Well,
They're
just,
just growing.
growing it,
Right.
yeah, with 30 employees.
Well, then they're selling something.
Well, they gotta be
Then
selling.
you're back to Tom's point,
That's-
and that
that's-
is traffic and whatever.
Okay,
whether
I thought
they-
you mean
whether
the
they-
farm stand you were talking about where the public comes to.
Yeah, whether they're
but-
selling wholesale and retail, then if you have that facility, you're still selling something, otherwise you're nuts.
Yeah, what are you doing it for?
Yeah, changing definition, I think that's a great idea, change the
Yeah, let's,
I think
let's work on
regular-
changing that definition.
Yeah.
Way too hard.
It's a- Chip?
I'm just gonna echo Jamie's comments, if you guys want any part of this to pass, I think that restricting agriculture
Yeah.
in any zone in this town
Mm.
is a guaranteed no vote for whatever else you have attached to it.
And I think it needs to be made clear that we're not talking about an individual having a garden or a plot of land, we're talking about a commercial operation where you're doing this to make a living. Mark, you're exempted. I can't
And
tell
what-
you how many times.
And really, what is, or a Christmas tree, you know, Wayne Allen's Christmas tree farm. What, how does that, asking the question, how does that negatively impact your neighbors?
Okay, so my neighbor comes up, my neighbor has a Christmas tree farm, and people come out and start chopping away at his trees and come onto my property and start chopping down my
That's a
trees.
whole
And
different
now I'm
problem.
gonna get arrested because I've been,
No, that's
Doing something
trespassing,
really
it has
stupid.
nothing to do with agriculture.
American
Yes,
has
ma'am.
a tree farm on the
I
money
think-
property.
It sounds like, and when was this comprehensive plan written, like 2005?
No, this
2016,
part of it is 2016,
2016.
which was the last amendment.
Part of it was, but it's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, well, yes.
Since
For
the
long-
90s.
For a long time, I mean, back when I was running for state rep, I remember the town center, and I said, the dump is the town center. That's where
We all said
everybody
that,
goes,
yes.
everybody goes there.
Still
Still doing that.
Wednesdays and Saturdays.
So, it
Sometimes on
seemed
Tuesday
like,
night.
one of the reasons that I moved to Arundel a long time ago was not because we're farmers. And I walked up and down Limerick Road every morning, you take your life into your hands when you're walking out on Limerick Road.
Oh, yes.
But I didn't move to Arundel to have a place to go walk. I moved to Arundel because it was a farming community. I wanted to have a hobby farm, which has become so incredibly popular. People want to be able to have their little niche farms. So you raise a few chickens for yourself and you raise a few chickens for your neighbor. I think the term commercial use to make a living is inappropriate, because nobody's making a living. That's only on TV, really. You know, none of us are driving brand spanking new King Ranches, four-wheel drives, making a living raising chickens. So, you might change the term, hobby farm, because everybody's got full-time jobs. I don't make a lot of money from my horses. I make sure that I'm a good ambassador with the neighbors, I make sure that everything's fine, I make sure when I'm raising chickens for myself, for my freezer, that maybe I have a few extra chickens to go somewhere else, or eggs. How many blue coolers have we seen around town? I mean, I think that is the official
Red
color.
too.
Yeah. Well, there is red, they are mostly blue.
Yeah.
However,
Mostly blue.
is that considered commercial enterprise? Nobody's making a living of selling eggs.
I would not consider that commercial. I think a
What's the
commercial,
difference? You're still selling it. What's the difference between tomatoes or eggs?
the difference
Don't forget
between
pumpkins.
doing,
Well,
the difference between doing something at home on a very small scale and doing a commercial operation is enormous.
I understand, but most of us, I mean, I kinda have land envy when I hear 350 acres or 400 acres or whatever. I get 3 1/3. I use 3 1/2, cause I use some of my neighbors, but I own 3 1/3. And I do pretty well on it for what I do. And I know other people who do pretty well on their 3 1/3 acres for what they do as well. And I think maybe the term hobby farm, which is, some for me, some for you, this is what having a farm is all about, this is what giving back to the land is all about. I think the term commercial has already that connotation of,
Which is why I'm saying that the commercial should be in the conditional use. And we should be looking at it saying, you've gotta have a certain amount of land, you've gotta have certain setbacks from everything. We don't know what those are going to look like right now, but to me, that's the commercial operation. I don't wanna restrict people from growing vegetables in their backyard, or growing anything else in their backyard.
I have one question. It's very simple. Has this been a problem?
It has not.
Leave it alone.
absolutely.
Because if we change it, it's gonna be a problem.
Leave it alone. Number 4.
Aquaculture, which is also not been a problem. We don't have it.
There we go.
I don't even know what it is.
Goldfish.
Raising of, commercial operation, raising of fish for commercial
We don't even
purposes.
know.
Rich?
My house used to be a salmon farm.
Used to be, it's not anymore.
Well, I know, but my point is, it was.
Okay.
That's agriculture, but that wasn't in R1.
Number 5, clearing for removal of vegetation for activities other than timber harvesting.
Okay, before we go much further, let's, I need to explain this stuff, so before we start tearing this stuff apart. First of all, this is all from the shoreline zoning requirements that have to be in the various districts, okay? We have to have these activities in the districts, they were in the matrix. When we shifted over to the new format, we had to make a promise not to change a single thing that was on the matrix. And in the matrix were all of these uses, as permitted uses by shoreline zoning. So that's why they're there. And they're all non-intensive uses. We can get rid of them, or else, actually, it's not such a bad idea. Clearing of vegetation for other activities besides timber harvesting, filling and earth moving activity greater than 10 yards, less than 100 cubic yards, that's in every ordinance. Fire protection activities, forest management activities except for timber harvesting. These are basically simple things that are required. And wildlife management practices, these are stuff that the state likes to see in our zoning comments.
That is permitted, correct?
These are all permitted uses.
All right, so why
In
don't
other
we
words,
just
you can
continue
clear- you
going
can
down
clear
there
the,
and
clear it
just
so
tell
you
us
can
the
have
ones
green
that
line.
need to stay because of that agreement.
I would say that, keep them all there, I don't see any, there's no problem in any, land management roads. It's basically timber road.
If we think they all need to stay there, what we're trying to do is kind of merge the comp plan. Why don't we
Marinas?
just look at the comp plan uses and see how they differ.
Should 8 and 19
Well, no,
be
right,
combined?
these uses.
These uses in the comp plan.
Yeah.
These
No.
uses.
But with that,
Should 8 and 19 be combined so they don't appear to contradict each other?
You just go right down here on the golf course, it's gonna take the rest of the road.
And it's designated around.
Which one, Chip?
Number 8 is forest management activities
Right, but it's not-
except for timber harvesting.
so they have to have.
And 19 is timber harvesting less than 40% basal area.
Can we have one conversation, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That makes sense.
Go back by one, by one, by one, by one, by one.
Yeah. Let's go back and look at 5, 6, 7, and 8. These are all required. These are required by
These are just in the shoreline zone.
the shoreline zone. These are all required by the shoreline zone to be in there.
They're not required for this district.
So
Are
we'll
they the only ones that come from shoreline zoning on this list?
You probably have soil and water conservation.
Soil and water conservation practices.
Wildlife management, you know,
Well,
And I
those
need,
very benign.
well, my suggestion would be to take all of those, group them together and make them the last ones. I understand it's alphabetical, and that's handy, but you wanna keep it alphabetical?
Well, either that or else we put it under land management, and we put it under a certain category.
Yeah, that-
Bullets.
I would think land management bullets would work better. But I'm really kind of curious about a couple of the things that are on here. Well, that's a permitted use, motorized vehicular traffic on existing roads and trails. Really? We have to tell you that it is permitted to drive your car on the
We
road?
probably can get rid of that. But that is, actually, that is, has to be
Yeah.
defined in the resource protection district.
Right.
It has to be, because it's not permitted as a matter of right in the resource protection district. But we can, actually, we can get rid of that.
We could take that out of here.
Is marinas really necessary?
Well, marinas,
Marinas fit into the aquaculture. We don't have any, and we're probably not going to.
Mark might dig a big pond.
right.
But that's
It'd
on
have to
his
be a
private
wicked
property,
big
we don't care.
pond.
I would say right now, I don't, unless, I don't.
I don't think it belongs in an R1 zone, I
There
could
don't
see
think
it,
it does
water
either.
now,
you know, I could see
Yeah,
it.
only one little piece there.
No, it doesn't belong there.
No.
Shorefront commercial.
Should we take marinas out?
No.
Take
Marinas out,
Yeah.
Okay.
that's a commercial operation.
It is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's permitted.
So let's jump back to,
Individual campsite, private
no,
campsite.
let's jump back to 9. Home occupation, home business.
Keep,
Do we
Yes.
define
Yes.
what is acceptable?
Yes.
What
Yes,
kind
we
of
do, and
business?
it actually is, and this is the irony, actually has to be approved as a conditional use, should go in conditional use section. Does not get a permit from a staffer who. So it needs to be,
And I wouldn't care.
He's talking home occupations.
yeah, home occupation.
So home
But you
occupation.
just moved individual private campsites.
Yep.
Eyes over the shoulder.
Sorry.
You wanna put a campsite on your property? Go right ahead.
Right now, that's a.
For an accessory
Commercial
use?
district.
So what camp on?
Delete my tent
Did-
tonight?
Was there a consensus on the home occupation? Did I hear that was going to?
It's
Conditional
going to,
use?
you need to get a permit to do it. You've gotta come and apply for it.
If you look at, in section 9(3),
But is,
No, you don't, it's permitted use.
but is the permit ever going to be denied, is my
which
question.
It says nothing about staff review, defined, nothing about it.
it goes, yeah, but here's the point, Jim's gotta do it. Yeah, you're right, it doesn't, it's not staff, it's the code enforcement officer gotta do it.
Well,
It's got, look at the conditions,
If it's a permitted use, you don't have to go to jail.
but look, where is it, what section is it in?
What do you mean?
He's saying you should move it down to the conditional.
What section?
Oh, you're
is-
moving it, I thought you were
No, no, no,
okay.
no, it's moving
Yeah.
to conditional,
Oh,
because it's in the
sorry.
conditional uses, you have to get a permit,
Yeah.
and that's why.
And how many people are gonna find out about that?
What about the conditional use?
Yeah.
Most people come into the office, if they're gonna be doing a home occupation or something, will come in to find out, and
And you tell
it
them
happens all the
procedure.
time, we give them a form, that basically Jim, you know, talks to them, finds out what they're doing, if it's okay, he signs off on it, if it's not, he tells them that they need to go to the planning board, and they do all the time, yeah.
What haven't I done now?
Okay.
I have a question about that, only from memory of a rather heated discussion, when at one time, some people thought home occupations weren't allowed somewhere, that's another big issue.
You're absolutely right.
And I'm kind of
Oh, I
thinking
remember that
that
one.
since it's not doing any harm as permitted, and again, we have a lot of difficulty explaining to people the difference between permitted, conditional, and you can't. And as soon as you say it's not permitted, they think you can't, and that's gonna make blood pressures go right up. I say we leave it there, the process is in place.
I disagree, and I'll tell you why, because number one, you have to get a permit to do it, and number two, all the standards are located in the conditional use section. The standards for a condition, you just don't do a home occupation, there are standards for it in section 9(3).
Doesn't mean that you can't have one, you just.
You just have to meet those standards, that's what a conditional use is, you meet the
But
special conditions.
No.
My point is that people don't necessarily understand that, and that is another one of those things that will shoot this down in town meeting.
I don't think so, because I deal with it
Oh, yeah,
every
will.
day. Every day we do conditional uses. Every day we deal with home occupations. People come in all the time, hey, I wanna do this. Okay, fill out this form. You gotta, meet all these standards.
I'm not even coming.
No,
Yeah.
I'm a permitted use, I don't need a permit.
right,
Well,
that's right.
You're not gonna see me.
And then you know what we do? When your neighbor complains, then we have
But
to
it's-
go in
but it's
and
been a
Just
investigate.
come down all day and try to.
Permitted.
You don't meet these standards.
But
You
it's
don't
been a
meet the standards.
permitted use for how long?
A long time.
Have we
Okay,
had an issue
under
with
your
it?
home occupation, okay, here's a good one for you. Under your home occupation, okay, if it's a conditional use or anything else, then you have to pay personal property tax.
So
Yeah.
here's the reason I think it should be a conditional use,
I'm,
okay?
I understand, my argument isn't that, it's just saying, I don't think you need a permit right now. If everybody wants to leave it like that,
Right
fine.
now, you don't need a permit.
I don't think,
Leave it
not
alone.
for me.
I think you do, because.
We need
That's you, your opinion. The rest of our opinion is saying
Now,
no.
Marty,
Permitted,
put a lip lock on it,
No.
I've got something to say about it, and I'm gonna tell you why I think it should be a permitted use.
We said it's
If you-
permitted.
No, I'm sorry, I meant conditional, why it should be a conditional use. It should be a conditional use because if you wanna repair cars in your garage and stack them in your front yard, you need to go to the town and say, this is what I wanna do, and find out whether or not you can. Because if you don't, you're going to end up with a junkyard in your front yard, and that's gonna hurt your neighbors.
So do you define occupational
Yes.
use?
Yes.
I mean,
We define
So
home
what-
occupation.
what requires a conditional
Doesn't
use
the code
permit and
enforcement
what
officer have
doesn't?
the ability
Yeah,
to
in this case,
go and
you
give
would go
somebody a
into town
citation
hall, they
for
would say,
assuming numbers
you
of
see that it's
vehicles?
conditional, you go find out, Sim sends you upstairs
How
to
many?
Jim, the Jim says, what are you gonna do? Here's your permit, or, no, you have to go to the planning board for that one.
Because right now it's wide open.
Right now, it's wide open. According to the ordinance, you don't have to ask for it, you can just do whatever you
Right,
want.
and
for
that's
that'd
home
be the
occupation.
definition.
Now, that's not true, Rich. It's not true.
It's
If you
permitted.
look, yeah, okay, but why don't you look in the conditional uses and you'll see that there are standards you have to meet to do it.
What I'm
And you
saying.
have to get a permit from the code
I
enforcement
understand that, but
officer.
what I'm saying is that people are gonna look at this and go, it's permitted, and they're gonna go do it. Because they don't, it's not a conditional, they don't have to go get a permit, they're just gonna go and do it.
They're already doing it.
They're already doing it, they should
How
be
can you
coming.
force me to get a conditional use permit if it's a permitted use?
Because there's a conflict in the ordinance.
I guess so.
And what we're trying to do is fix it.
And that's why it should move down to conditional use.
Then what are you gonna do with the standards? What do you do with the standards then, Dan?
No, he's
There's-
saying that's why it should be
There's
moved.
standards in there. What do you do with those?
Well, wait a minute, why can't,
Irrelevant.
It's not relevant, because the more restrictive applies, Tom, you know that. The
No,
more
no, no,
restrictive-
no, the less restrictive applies.
No, the more restrictive
I
applies.
disagree.
No, I disagree. The more restrictive, if there's a conflict in the ordinance, the more restrictive applies. So conditional use, you're gonna have to meet those standards right now. Otherwise, let me tell you guys, you're gonna get all sorts of stuff in your neighborhood you don't want. I mean, you really are. It's gonna be huge
But
amounts
you
of stuff.
why can't you specify what?
It is, it's specific.
Okay.
Nobody has their ordinance here. but-
I do.
All right, look at your ordinance, look at home occupation in section 9, section 9.3.
Doesn't even make reference to section 9.3. It's an occupation, profession, activity.
You're looking
which
at the
is carried out
definition,
successfully.
look in the section.
Well, that's where I'm going. I'm going from the use here, and that's what it says. I go to the definition, that's what it says. And it doesn't everywhere tells me that I have to go get a permit.
That's right, that's why we need to fix it.
That's why we need to move it
They
down.
have to.
Well, that's why you wanna change it.
No, but yeah, to make it clear, otherwise, what are you gonna do, get rid of the other section?
But you don't want everybody going into the office to get a conditional use permit for a home occupation.
You do.
Well, no, you do, even if you're an architect or.
so is there
He's a
any way of taking,
Everybody coming in
Can I
to do
say-
anything.
go ahead, Tina.
Well, I guess it's not a conditional use permit that Jim gives. He just gives an approval for a home occupation. All it is a one-page form that they fill out saying, I'm gonna be,
No, that's your business thing, that's not,
your
that's not.
business
the-
registration
Yeah,
form.
but the
But-
business registration form isn't what's involved in it.
Right, no,
It's
no, but
getting a
listen to me,
permit.
what I'm saying is, if somebody comes in here and into the town hall and says that I'm going to be doing some bookkeeping in my house, and, you know, and Jim will look at it and sign off and say, that's allowed where you are, so he signs off on it, and we file their name, and,
That's
but
not how it works.
if he says, no, that's not permitted where you are, you need to go see the planning board, and he sends them to you, and then they go for a
But that's not how
conditional
it
use
works.
permit.
No, that's not how it works at all, because what you have.
No, she's telling you that is how it
That's
works.
been how it's been working,
No,
because
because you don't see it downstairs, you don't see us, what we do upstairs.
you do a conditional use
We
permit
do,
for
but
everybody?
we go through every single one of those home occupations, make a determination. Number one, are you 25% of the floor area? That's number one. Number two, you know, what is the use typical for that particular area. These are judgment calls.
So
Is that a use that's traditionally done in the home?
I said, you gotta meet the definition.
Right, what I'm saying
Not the
though,
definition, the standards.
what do they get in their files?
Well, let's look at the standards.
I'm not looking at standards, period. I mean, if I meet the definition, I'm good.
I understand exactly what you're saying, Tom, and I would tend to agree with you. That's
I
the
think
point at which
point
most
what
people
points to
will
the
stop.
standards. Right, there's nothing that points to the
There's
standards.
nothing.
I think that's what Tom is trying to, there's a definition, but.
Yeah,
Well, we don't,
if I looked at
if
the
we have
definition, I would,
definitions here,
yeah,
we
okay, I
don't,
can
we
do
don't
that.
say you gotta get a permit in the definitions.
No.
It doesn't say a
No, but it'll
agricultural
say it
facility.
here, I would have, you know.
And
So we
if it
need,
was a conditional use, then I know I've gotta go get a permit or
right, so
something.
we should put it there.
we should put it in.
I agree.
I think,
Disagreeing with that, I'm just saying that to make it
I know you have an arrow.
No, I would say
yeah,
right
we
now.
do. I think we're all in agreement that it should be conditional, use. Most of it.
Mr. Chair, what time are we out of here?
Oh,
And this is at the town meeting, and they will not pass that change. You can change it, you can all agree on it, but when you take it to town meeting, it will not pass. So you need to find a way to put a home occupation under approved with the conditions, or whatever you need to do under it, telling them then they need to get a permit, or whatever it is. You need to change that section to clearly define what we do today. Without moving it to conditional.
Yeah, occupation with approval, with co-approval,
Okay, hold on, yes, slash with permit,
not permit, with
so,
co-approval.
with code, well, whatever phrase. I don't
Permit,
know.
That's it.
permit required.
That means conditional.
No, conditional means
It requires a permit, it's conditional.
I guess my difference of, is the people who just come into the office and get reviewed by, maybe whatever discussion you have upstairs, they get reviewed by Jim as far as saying, okay, this is okay in your residential area, and you sign off on it that day half the time, or whatever, and if they don't come down with any kind of form other than the business
No,
registration
because
form,
you don't get those forms. You don't need those forms. We keep those forms.
we get them downstairs,
You get the business form.
What I'm
The
saying
business
is,
form.
what I'm saying is, conditional use to me is conditional permit by planning board.
No,
Other than
or
that-
staff review, or the code enforcement officer has the ability to issue a conditional use permit.
Well,
It has-
maybe
he
upstairs.
does- Well, no, again, all right,
Okay.
it just is.
let's look at our calendars and figure out the next meeting.
A lot of things, a lot of things are going.
And it's been working.
Time?
I haven't heard of any big issues with home occupations.
Maybe that's because people are coming in to get the permit.
What do you schedule look like? I'm out of town in 2 weeks.
Well, isn't that what they're supposed to
It
do?
would be the next meeting.
Not under the ordinances I read it.
But he just said that they look at the permits when they bring them upstairs.
Said Diana, you have to go those days.
Okay.
If I'm a
So,
home
if you do
occupation, if I
this
put an
on
office, a
second
lawyer's
or
office
second
in my
and fourth
home,
Thursdays.
Oh, you're saying you don't even need to go in and get a permit?
We used to meet on Tuesdays.
unless it's a conditional use or we make reference to these conditions.
I could do Tuesdays.
Well, if we're gonna change that, we're gonna have to make sure that we have some pretty hefty evidence or explanation to take back to town meeting, because that will not.
Well, and would it be mitigated by what kind of zone you're in, if you're in an R1 or an
No,
R4?
they're allowed in all
or whatever?
residential
They're
districts.
listed as permitted in all the residential.
And all the residential zones. Because again, in other places, it has to do with the quiet enjoyment of whether or not your activity impacts the quiet enjoyment of your neighbor's property. So if you're a bookkeeper or an attorney, is different than having a machine shop or a mechanic.
And I'll give you an example, we have, Roger will probably remember this, we had a staff review committee going over a home occupation, that they made an application, in which, they wanted to put a home brewery. And, it was permitted.
I was
I
gonna
mean,
say, doesn't everybody want?
well, everybody does, but they wanted to do it for commercial purposes, so they came in and asked for a home occupation for a commercial brewery. And they were gonna do X number of barrels, they were gonna do it in an existing garage. And, we did the notification like we're supposed to, and half the neighborhood came out. And, they basically argued to the staff review committee that this was not a permitted, this was not an appropriate use for the district. And again, the same sort of thing where the homeowner actually said, forget it, I'll go to another location, I'm not gonna get my neighborhood angry about this. But it was a situation where they challenged whether that's appropriate and something that's traditionally done in a neighborhood, in a home. I argued that that's where home brewing always starts, but, that was a situation where actually we did have a lot of opposition to a proposed home occupation.
Right, no, I understand
And
why there
and
would
the
be,
fact
but
that
I'm
we
just
notified
saying,
people, we notified them of this activity occurring in their neighborhood, and they objected.
But you have limits on what can be done as a home occupation.
It's, there's the, now, Sim, you're bringing up a good rub, because it's what's traditional and customary done in the home. That's an open, that's a big loose can.
and that changes daily.
It can change.
Yeah, it does.
It can change. You can do a doctor's office, well, Jim, sometimes we disagree. Doctor's office, sometimes it's considered to be
There cannot be so many different.
Yeah, and you have the same problem.
auto repair.
There you go.
Okay, handling.
I think we're gonna get through all this.
Okay,
What are you looking at for the next meeting?
Tuesday the 18th. The problem with meeting, of September, the problem with meeting on Thursdays is that the planning board meets every other Thursday, and a lot of people are involved with the historical society, which meets on the opposite Thursdays. So Thursdays pretty much get tied up. Does Tuesday work for you guys?
No.
Okay. What day would work for you?
Wednesday?
Wednesdays does not work for me, I'm out of town every Wednesday night. I'm looking at Tuesdays, I don't know how that works for the rest of you.
What's that,
Mondays
next
that
one?
are not selectmen's meetings.
We could do Mondays that are not selectmen's meetings.
Oh, that's road construction.
Oh, that's right, we're working on the road.
Or not.
I forgot about that.
Hopefully, we're headed to the end of the road there.
One way or the
That's
other.
what you guys do.
I said that before.
Just to throw it.
Tom, I thought we were there 2 weeks ago. I mean, a month
Wednesday
ago.
is budget board.
So,
They'll be starting.
That would shoot Wednesdays out of date, so we're looking at, right now, we're looking at either Tuesday or Friday.
so the week of the 17th, 18th, 19th, that week is gone, we're doing interviews for the buildings.
In the evening?
Yes.
Okay.
Selectmen meeting is on, the 24th,
What's that?
selectmen's meeting on the 24th.
Is that right, Jen?
Yeah, 10th and the 24th.
24.
Yeah.
25th is what?
Tuesday.
Yeah, okay. What's going on in
Well, the thing is, I booked as far as the library for the selectmen for Mondays and for Tuesdays. Mondays and Tuesdays now, for December, because of, between the building committee meetings, reviews and things like that, and the road design meetings. Somebody just, at any rate.
Doesn't leave us a lot of wiggle room.
I mean, we can use
Because if
another
you guys
room,
take out Monday and Tuesday,
we can do another room.
Yeah, another room.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to use this.
Conference room is.
Well, it's not a small crowd, that's the problem.
And you won't be able to make any meetings if you're doing other interviews and.
That's just that week, we're just doing interviews the 17th, 19th, and 20th.
well, let's do it on Tuesday the 18th, and we'll meet in another room. And then, we'll start looking at it every other Tuesday. So we'd be looking at the 18th, and then I think it's the 2nd of October.
Tuesdays until the middle of October, I won't be available, but don't stop on my.
That's okay.
Same with
Yeah.
me.
I don't bring nothing with me.
No, but if they send out the agenda, Dan, you can send
How often do we stick to the agenda?
I was just gonna say, what are the odds you're gonna anticipate the next crisis?
True,
We did not.
I said, we move
And
it
we will
as
pick
slow,
up
as slow pace.
Right where we left off.
But better to move it at a slow pace here than move at no pace at town meeting.
Sorry. Terminal paper cut.
So
Very
we'll,
good.
we'll meet on the eighteenth,
Also,
7 o'clock.
That should be fine,
location to be determined.
that's the plan.
Mr.
Chair, I'd like to make a motion that we adjourn for this evening.
And we will pick up,
What are we gonna do?
we got the number 2, so we'll keep the same agenda. Take,
We'll just move everything up one.
take a look at everything that's on the list,